Good
morning, everyone. Excited to talk about AI today. I got to imagine that when you first talked about AI, like, maybe a few years ago and talked about the prospect of AI, it was one of those things like, oh my gosh, this is really, really cool. And this is profound change. And 2 years later, you're kind of like, we've talked about it in every other class. And this is another one. This is kind of an interesting one, a little interesting activity, although there are some caveats to that. I think this activity becomes less effective over time. Hopefully we'll still have some interesting results. So I was grading some of my students here in the online section, and the tools they were using were answering every question correctly, regardless of the prompting level. So I'm just kind of curious if that's where we're eventually heading. You remember we talked about it in Advanced AS last semester. The current version of AI is basically the worst version that you're going to be using. We're probably going to reach the point there's going to be such a saturation, especially just of Truman students inputting vector questions into ChatGPT and Copilot, that eventually they'll have the entire database down and they'll be able to justify the answers because of the quite there, but workflow meaningless. So this is one of those ones that I think is very interesting. So I want to share a story, and this is not meant to dampen the enthusiasm for AI, or even dampen your enthusiasm for auditing. I just want to show you where the prospects are heading. So one thing that I think is we've been having some discussion lately with professionals, both in the accounting networks and in professional and public accounting, as well as educators. And one of the concerns is making sure that there's a sufficient pipeline of appropriate individuals. And so that's a separate argument. It's not really relevant to this. But ancillary to the argument is the question about whether public accounting firms are willing to let go of new associates who they don't think are making sufficient progress. In the past, the answer to the question is no. Basically, is they were saying, if you're qualified, if you got your degree, and you're willing to do the work, then we'll put you in the seat. Well, I received an email, and this is about a year ago, right around March or February or March, or right around this time last year. It was actually a former Truman Mac student, and the student kind of had an experience that was shared by a lot of other students, and this is just speculation. It's not been confirmed, but I can tell you basically what the Truman student happened. So the student had graduated from the program and started preparing for the MAC program, and had passed 2 parts, but had not passed the other 2 parts, and their 18-month window had elapsed. So that's the good news is that you all have longer than 18 months now. I think it's 36-month window, or 30. Is it 30 or 36 months? 30. Okay. So that's good news. The bad news is that once you get on the path of not trying to make any progress and you're just working full time, it's much harder to pass the CPA exam once you're working through that. So the student didn't make much, or I shouldn't call it student, the graduate didn't make much progress in the CPA exam. The window elapsed, and as a result, the CPA firm says we're concerned that you are not going to ever get your CPA license, and the student was let go as part of the round of layoffs for that firm. Now, this is one of those things that doesn't happen very often. They do restrict upward mobility, but to my knowledge, this is the first time that I'd heard about this concept of letting go students, or you call them students, employees who had not actually made sufficient progress in the CPA exam. And so part of that, I think, is speculation, is the fact that when you're doing the work, they expect you to actually increase your ability to do constructive, critical thinking tasks. And you do need to become an expert in that area, because we do have tools now that can do the grunt work. And if that's all you're good for, then they can find other ways to do that. They don't even require having an employee sitting in the shoes, sitting at the desk. I'm mixing that metaphors today. Sitting at the desk. And so this is, again, speculation on my part, but I do think that the introduction of advanced technological tools like AI and some other tools in that realm, they are not a direct threat to your job, which is kind of the first question that all accounting students ask, like, are we going to be replaced? And the answer is, it depends. If you are making sufficient upward progress and are adding value consistently to your profile, I don't think that this is going to be a threat. If you are lackadaisical and just saying, I want to do the minimal amount of work possible, I do think this is a really very real concern. I think this is a reflection upon that. Now, I probably should not have led with that. I probably should have finished with that because now everybody's just kind of like, okay, I hate AI. It's going to threaten my job. The simple truth is, I think everybody in this room is easily capable of outpacing. I just think this particular student was not aware of the threat and did not take the preparation seriously, and as a result, ended up having that to happen. And it's not even clear as to whether AI is the main perpetrator. This is speculation on my part. But I do think that something you have to keep in mind is that you are going to have to keep your skills sharp. You're going to have to be diligent about that. Otherwise, you may find yourself in a similar position. Now, that being said, AI does have some interesting promise in that regard, is the fact that there's a lot of things that AI can do much more effectively and more quickly than we can do as human beings. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk a little bit about what the prospects for use of AI tools are going to be in accounting, specifically in auditing, and what our responsibilities are for that area. And then we're going to kind of wrap up with what I thought was the fun scenario. So I did this last semester. It was in ChatGPT 3.5. We tried to answer some questions and we tried to speculate on why ChatGPT missed. I was pleasantly surprised. I guess maybe I shouldn't be. It shouldn't be pleasant, but I was pleasantly surprised that there were some arguments with the AI tools with respect to the answers that were being given. So I'm interested to see what kind of controversies that you all ran into with your questions here. For context, when I did this last year, it was entirely zero prompt inputs, and so my students just basically copied the questions in. They had to copy a lot more questions in than you all did. I think you did 12 questions, and so I think I just had my students do all the CPA exam questions that we talked about. So it was a lot more detailed work in that, but it was zero prompt. So basically, it was just kind of copy and pasting and then and analyzing the results. And just for context, we'll talk about that, what the results are that you all personally came up with. Like I said, I've already looked at one student's output, and one student had 100% on all forms of prompts. But you had to do some different prompting mechanisms, which I think are going to be very useful moving forward. But let's go ahead and go over our articles and talk a little bit about what some of the things that I want you to take away from this discussion are. Not just that ChatGPT is going to be able to pass the CPA exam or not, but some concerns about AI. And all right, so there's some argument there that something was going on with respect to AI, just not weighing up the conversation. Although you can note that AI is not fully evolved, because when the fire alarm went off, you will notice that this is actually setting professional auditors asking if we were playing music in the background. And so yeah, apparently AI tools cannot recognize pop music just yet. So yeah, that was exciting. So let's get back to what we were talking about, and we'll see. I'm going to say if the fire alarm goes off again, then there's going to be some outside conspiracy preventing us from having our conversation today. So that's what I'm going to hold to. But yeah, first one was talking about reliance on Gen AI, and this is a few years old, but it was a KPMG survey saying that 70% of those who expect to, or 70% of financial executives companies with annual revenues of $1 billion or more have deployed or are planning to implement more broadly over the next 2 years. So within the window of the time that this article came out, now these companies will have or had already implemented AI tools with respect to their operations. And of course, we have KPMG here making the statement. So the KPMG vice chair saying, as auditors, we must lead deploying AI responsibly. Which, as an auditor, I do take some context in that. Says, yeah, that's actually going to be important with respect to that. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. Of course, I do make a comment that it's KPMG there making the comment, which is I like to poke fun of my former alumni making comments like that. But anyway, so some of the things that it talked a little bit about, they expect auditors to evaluate their use of AI. These are executives in the companies, the billion-dollar companies. Expect executive auditors to evaluate the use of AI by conducting third-party attestation or detailed reviews of control environments. So this is kind of our first takeaway, is that the audit role is probably going to change over the next few years and incorporate AI analysis. Now, you'll notice we've not done much AI analysis either at 417 or 615 in this course. That's simply because it just doesn't really exist yet. But as you all moving auditors in the workplace, this is something that you're likely going to have to evaluate: is how do we actually test information tools? I was talking to a former student who had graduated many years ago. We'll say graduated in 2019, and is a senior. Was a senior at the time, and then is about to become a manager at KPMG. They were talking about one of the biggest concerns that they have with respect to auditing now is something that is somewhat unfamiliar. It's auditing information, and the idea behind auditing information is not just that we're auditing the financial statement in details, but the supplemental information that goes basically into building financial statements. So as you know, financial statements are an aggregation of a whole bunch of financial information, the summary of the entire results. But the information that goes into that can either be qualitative or quantitative. Quantitative, we know very well how to analyze. We've talked about that in many, many classes, not just your auditing classes, but in your financial accounting classes. But how do we analyze qualitative information, the quality of information? That's an interesting question that's become a lot more prominent issue on accounting firms, auditors. So I do think one of the most interesting things talked about here is that on a macro scale, it's possible to think the auditors can be called upon to audit AI itself, to evaluate AI itself. So we're going to have to evaluate AI tools. Now, in one way, that's a little bit daunting because I'm going to be honest, I'm not familiar with how all these AI tools work. Probably a good thing I'm not really an auditor out there. But on the other hand, what will be the approach that we would take in something like that? We're not necessarily concerned about what the internal mechanisms are, but we are very focused on what are the processes and what are the results. That's something we've talked about a lot in our auditing classes, is that we need to understand by what processes do we utilize a particular technology tool, and what are the expected results of those. And that's just basically our re-performance tasks that we talked about, or our walkthroughs that we talked about with respect to controls. We can implement something very similar to that with respect to AI testing. Obviously, it would be a little bit more complex and a little bit more nuanced, because you wouldn't get the exact same results every time, as LLMs and AI tools are by design not supposed to provide the same experience every single time you interact with them. But to that end, if we're talking about what our expectations are, we can generally have a pretty good idea of what we think is going to happen before the analysis takes place. So then we talk a little bit about what AI can do for auditors, and this will go into a little bit more detail about how auditors can actually use AI testing systems. And they say one of the biggest benefit is the overall efficiency, which makes sense because we've talked a lot about data analytics within the context of accounting, and auditors tend to use data analytics very freely, very actively. It's become more and more of an issue. I will say this is something that I did 20 years ago when I was working in public accounting, so we're still actively using data analytics. Our techniques were not nearly as refined, but the data tools that we were using were much better than kind of the rudimentary auditing techniques that we were left with at the time. Remember we talked about sampling back in 417, and we said auditors still rely on sampling? What would be the optimal scenario if it was possible? Would it be to test a sample of items or to test all of the items? And the answer is, ignoring the fact that you don't want to do more work, if you could do all of them with the same amount of work, you'd like to test the entire population instead of just a sample. Because that's the whole focus of this idea of audit risk, is that an auditor can do a certain level of work and do it properly and still come up with an appropriate conclusion. A good way to hedge against that is to do more work in a particular realm and get more assurance. So if we can actually do more testing in that area, that is going to be more efficient. And so we did this back in 2005, believe it or not, back in the olden days when, back when I was working in accounting, and the rest of you all were still enjoying SpongeBob SquarePants, okay? But I don't know, was that the appropriate shows around that time frame? Okay. Yeah. I only know a little bit about SpongeBob, so when I ask questions, they're legitimate questions from my own curiosity. But and so what that involved is utilizing a computer-assisted auditing tool like IDEA, which I think most everybody in this room is familiar with, IDEA to do the analysis for us. Now we've got AI tools can do those tasks, and they can do them automatically. And they actually use an example of manual journal entry testing. This is something that, following the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, actually shortly before the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, it was enacted as part of the Statements on Auditing Standards, but was adopted by the PCAOB. But this is something that's required in public company audits nowadays, is that they actually have to check manual journal entry populations, which makes sense because if we're concerned about the threat of fraud, what is one area that fraud traditionally occurs? It's through the creation of manual journal entries to manipulate financial statement data. So that's one of the areas that I worked really heavily on, and it's kind of humbling to know that this area that I worked, and I considered it a very valuable resource and a very valuable asset with driven data analytics,
AI tools can now do the work that I did in a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost. So I'm basically being rendered obsolete, which again, that's actually pretty much an accurate statement. Every single day I become a little bit more and more obsolete. But yeah, with respect to that actual task, the AI tools are evolving in that regard. And so there's also targeted information gathering, which is really important. And this is actually going to be relevant with trying to find information that's relevant to a particular area. Now, we already know a little bit about targeted information gathering already. There's a very simple scenario that we can talk about with respect to that. We could say, do we need to look at transactions that meet a certain threshold? So we can pull all transactions that are above our materiality scope for a certain account. So if we say materiality in this account is $500,000, we can pull all transactions automatically that are above that and flag them for testing, because any misstatement in those transactions could lead to a misstatement in the account. That'd be an easy example of that. But it could be something more distinct and more subtle than that, and with respect to how AI evaluates this. One of the areas that I tend to focus on when I talk about journal entry testing is I talk about we're looking for transactions types that don't necessarily meet a norm. For example, if you see a transaction that has a debit to revenue, is that something that's going to raise a cause for alarm? What do you guys think? Debits to revenues, those occur very frequently. Yeah. Not, hopefully not. Okay, so those might be one transaction we see debit to revenue. We can pull those. And now we know the journal entry tools can do that automatically for us. And so, yeah. Some interesting areas that can happen. Again, I think one of the biggest issues that we're talking about with respect to why these teams do not use these tools is just simply because of lack of training and infrastructure. And that seems counterintuitive, because the whole goal of these tools is to make our lives easier. If you go to an LLM or an AI tool, the whole idea is that there's something that you could do that would be time consuming, and you should be able to use one of these tools and it does it much more effectively. Now, to a macro level, we already know about that. This is something that we're very concerned about in education. Everybody has taken the capstone course in here, and probably Dr. Otero and Dr. Eisen says you cannot use an AI tool, you cannot use an LLM to write the paper for you. We know that's something that these tools can do. We know that's something that they're capable of, and if we just limited to that, then it wouldn't be a problem if that was all they did. But they're capable of so much more, and the problem is that we're constrained by the fact that we don't know all that they can do, and that kind of sets our intimidation factor. The joke I make is actually a multifold joke, and I'm sure I probably made this joke in advanced AS. But if you really want to set a whole bunch of accounting educators in panic, put them in a teaching session where they say you're going to learn all about AI tools. And they were just kind of like the people who are teaching are basically saying they can do tons of different things. The sky's the limit. And then you have a whole bunch of hands that raise up and say, what specifically can it do? I need to know exactly what it can do and show me exactly the steps I have to walk through. There's not a whole lot of longitudinal thinking in that regard. It's more about I want to know exactly what the steps are. And then kind of in the same regard, we were doing one for the School of Business. Matt actually helped me develop the project last year, a presentation. I'm not going to mention names, but some of the older faculty, their eyes were bright wide, just wide open, just like deer in the headlights type thing when I was talking about all the things they could do use AI tools for. There's just like, no, don't show me any more information. I don't want to learn this. This is too intimidating, too scary. Again, not going to mention any names, but they may have been the professors who were a little further on in their years here at the university. So yeah, and yeah. Now, I don't want anybody to take one. I don't want you to go storm me up to Dr. Otero and say, Dr. Barnes was talking trash about you, okay? Actually, Dr. Otero wasn't even at that session, but I just want to make sure that I'm not going to mention any names. I don't want you to take any names by implication. Dr. Otero, you can eliminate the process from that process because she was not at that meeting, so she was not about that. But I have to say that because if I don't throw that context out there, I know somebody's going to say, yeah, Dr. Barnes is talking trash about all the other faculty. It's like, no, I'm just saying they're uncomfortable with using AI tools, which makes sense. But lack of training infrastructure is certainly problematic, and people just don't know what that's used for. And I will count myself in there. I do think that there's a lot more possibility and an opportunity with respect to AI. I do not consider myself to be one of those people that uses AI tools on an everyday basis, and I probably should get more acclimated to doing that. I think the technology being too expensive is one of those things that the barrier to entry is going to go down. But this is an interesting one to say technology is not useful. And when we say technology is not useful, last year when I was talking about this, I second guessed that. I questioned that. I said, I do think the technology is useful. I just think that people don't know how to use it. So they perceive it as not being useful.
But I was recently reading an article, it's on Yahoo, and they were actually talking about AI tools not having the benefits that was predicted, looking a year and a half along the line. So AI tools can actually provide an incredible benefit, but it's not meeting the scale of what people were predicting, which, to be fair, it was a pretty intimidating scale to actually maintain. So do the AI tools have promise potential? Yes. Are they meeting it as a rapid pace as we thought? Probably not. Okay. But yeah, some interesting takeaways with that. And then the final one, which is kind of interesting, was ChatGPT. Now, I do want to clarify something on this on the CPA exam with ChatGPT. So first of all, they actually graded according percentages, which is not Becker. The AICPA has actually stated that that's not how they grade the CPA exam. The CPA exam, the 75, is based on what they believe is a 75 representative score for the entire population. And that changes from exam to exam because they basically make it an algorithmic routine saying, if 75 is a passing grade, here's how we set the bar. So you may score like a 65% on one exam, and that would be considered a 75 score of 75 on the exam based on your performance, based on the weight that they give to different questions based on previous performance. Another person may take a different version of the exam and they may score a 69, and that may be like a 73 because the exam itself was easier. And so this is a little bit hard to evaluate. So I just want to throw that out there because as you're preparing for the CPA exam in the future, you may say, well, I'm not hitting that 75%. You're not really aiming for a 75%, you're aiming for a score of 75, which is a little bit different. It's not 75% of the questions accurate. That being said, they didn't really have the algorithmic details of AICPA's exam scoring, so that's kind of why they scored here. And you can kind of see this ChatGPT scores were here. So 4.0, really, really impressive, average of around 85%. And then 3.5, average around 40%. Now, the takeaways they talked about are the different types of prompting. They talked about the scenarios, and they talked about, first of all, how they approached 4.0, because this was the original study. And they basically said ChatGPT 3.5 is not equipped, which makes sense because 3.5 was designed. It was basically trained on literally 1,000th of the data that ChatGPT 4.0 was tested on. And if you remember, we talked about the nature of these LLM tools. Basically, they're kind of text predictors, and the more text they have to evaluate, the more detail and the more precise they can be with their token assessment. So in this particular scenario, it's using literally 1,000th of the data. If we think about that in context to human beings, what would be an example of somebody who has literally 1,000th of the data that you have? You probably talk about like a preschooler, okay? So imagine you taking the CPA exam versus a preschooler taking the CPA exam. We'd probably see this particular disparity right here. And the only reason this wouldn't be lower is because there would probably be some guessing if you gave them the little bit gave them the crayon to circle the correct answers. They could probably get the multiple choice questions, at least 1/4 of those correct. But yeah, that's kind of the disparity we're talking about here. And talked a little bit about how it got to this score, because it originally didn't have that. It started out in the 4.0 scenario, and it basically said it performed better, but its average score was 6.78. That was actually the zero-shot prompting. So they did what was called what we call a few-shot prompt, but they called a 10-shot prompt. Saying they gave a sample of 10 questions, and they got really close to 75%, 74.4. Then they started using chain of thought, which is basically where they explained the nature of the answers and the concepts within this particular area, and then gave questions in that area to try to prompt it to the ChatGPT to start thinking along those lines. And I think that was kind of the key that was necessary, because then they said they averaged 84.3% across all 4 sections. Now, the interesting thing is that when we talk about a zero-shot prompt, we were even probably less than that last year when we did this activity, because I just told students to copy and paste in there. And one of the interesting takeaways that we came up with is that we didn't say the first part is a question, the remaining 4 parts, or remaining 4 lines, these are possible answers to the question. You need to select one that's a possible answer. We just basically put the question in there and let ChatGPT do the work. And what we came up with is that in a lot of scenarios, what ChatGPT was doing is it was ignoring the question as the information and just identifying statements that were correct statements. So it'd be like saying, which of the following is most relevant to an auditing class? And then say, the first answer is the sky is blue. And it would select A. And the reason it would select A is because A is a factual statement. It's not relevant to the question being asked, but it's a factual statement. And so that's kind of something that we need to get over, and why I think that this idea of chain of thought prompting is so important, because you do have to actually prepare a tool for understanding.
we kind of take it for granted because everybody in this room has taken so many multiple choice questions that you sit down and see a question and a series of answers. You're just like, I know what I'm supposed to do here. That's not a given in a particular scenario where you're talking about an AI tool. Now, the AI tools are adapting. They're starting to see certain formats and say, all right, I've seen this format before. I know what I'm supposed to do, but this is how I'm going to approach it. And so that was kind of something that I didn't actually specify in the instructions. I probably should specify, saying that you do need to tell the AI tool the next our series of questions. The start's going to be the question, and then they're going to fear four answers labeled A, B, C, and D. I think a lot of us just kind of blurted the questions in there and expected the ChatGPT to perform. And the good news is that I think now it's gotten to the point that we probably don't even need to prompt it in that regard, but there may have been some issue with that last year when we were doing this assignment. All right, so here comes the fun part. Here comes the fun part. So I had every one of the groups do 3 multiple choice questions in group's choice, and I want you to do each of the prompts that were mentioned in the article. And I did have a note here, please use different MCQs for each prompting technique, which if you missed that note and your group did something different, I already know some of the groups did here. Apparently, one of the tax track students who I hold really high regard for and speak very highly of missed my note right here. So apparently the notes are just not there. The notes are afterthoughts. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm giving that particular student grief. I think we all know who I'm talking about, but it's a Kyle, but it's not the one in this room. Okay, so yeah. Anyway, everybody's going to say, Kyle, Dr. Barton's called you out in auditing. It's like, yeah, well, that may be the first time that I called out Kyle. So what did I want you to do? I want you to use some of these techniques, and I want you to kind of summarize what your findings are from these results. So here's what I'm going to do. We're going to go through each of the groups, and what I want you to do is kind of summarize what you found, what your group found with respect to the results, starting with zero shot prompt, moving to the few shot chain of thought, and see if there was any specific difference in the responses in the accuracy of the responses and the nature of the responses, or the nature of the reasoning behind the responses based on the prompts that were given. So holding your groups up first. What'd you find out with respect to, what was your general summary of these results here?
For zero shot, few shot prompt, and no shot chain of thought, they were all 9 for 9 for those 3, but for the few shot chain of thought, one of them got wrong, and we were trying to teach it with the information before prompting the question, and it still was getting it wrong. So
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you remember which question it was that you were?
It was one of the price of square footage.
Oh, so the analytical procedures question about which one?
It kept saying turnover of personnel in accounting department was correct, and we went through and tried changing it, but after the second one, it still said A was correct.
Which is a reasonable conclusion, because looking over the answers when I was doing the grading, a lot of people used that particular question as their answer, which I think that keep in mind that it probably has access to this information that's probably been input into these tools multiple times. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's been input with the correct answer multiple times, just what the answer is. And so I do think there was a similar argument in that scenario. So this is kind of interesting. So it didn't really seem to matter what the prompt is. Now, this actually goes back to what I was talking about before. Remember, we talked about Ethan Mollick's 4 rules of using intelligence back in advanced AIS. And the 4th rule is, or I think it was the 4th rule. The 4th rule is, remember, this is the worst AIS you'll ever use. So when we did this last year, and I was using it with ChatGPT 3.5, that was a far inferior version with far less information that it could use. And it looks like the Copilot and the back end of ChatGPT 4.0 or 4.0 actually has sufficient information to be able to answer these questions more accurately, even without prompting. And so it probably has seen these questions many times and can actually answer these questions accurately, though it is a little bit discouraging that the areas that it should be doing better at, it actually did worse at. So it's
also providing a much larger response for the last 2 prompt techniques. And the first 2 just say I think it's A, here's why, and that was it. And it was 3 for 3 for the first 2.
Interesting. So it gave the right answer, but it didn't actually provide as much justification for those. Now, I wonder if that's kind of a function of the expectation of the user. If it provides a zero shot prompt, that these people are just looking for an answer and not really a justification. Whereas if they do if you're doing a chain of thought prompt, then it's saying, oh, this person would like to know what my rationalization is. So that's interesting. Okay, so good finding there. Maddie, what'd your group find?
Zero shot and few shot, one person, it got it wrong. And then for no shot and few shot, it's kind of like varied.
Very. Okay, any interesting takeaways or conclusions that you reached about the results?
I mean, we use different techniques. A lot of them.
So each of you individually use different techniques as far as what your approach was? Did you have any questions that you answered that one person got it right, and or one person, because you mentioned to me yesterday that you used the same questions, multiple of you did the same questions, but across different prompts. Was there any one question that they got right in one area and wrong in another area?
Questions. It like got it right like the first 2 times, and then I think it was kind of like it gave similar results, but not like actual right answer.
Which question was it?
After fieldwork audit procedures are completed, a partner of the CPA firm who has not been involved in the audit process firms a second or wrap-up review of the audit document. This review usually focuses on.
So I need to remember that was kind of the quality review, trying to make sure that the information of the working papers is consistent with the opinion being rendered, something along those lines. Which, yeah, you can tell I'm not the AI tool because I don't remember exactly what it is, but yeah. So I thought it was interesting because you talked to me about your response a little bit earlier, and that was kind of because last year when we did this process, everybody was using the same question base, and what was an interesting contention point is when one group would ask a question and the ChatGPT would get it right, another group asked the exact same question and ChatGPT got it wrong. And what would be the reason for that inconsistency? And the answer is, I have no idea. You would assume that if it has the information accurate the first time around, it would come up with the detail. So this is kind of a little bit of a problem. These LLMs are designed by nature to provide some little variance in their responses. If you ask it the same question multiple times, so if you say, I'm going to ask it a question and then I'm going to clear its cache of memory and ask it the same question, it should come up with roughly the same answer, but it will not be verbatim, word for word, the exact same response. But what we're finding there is that there's sometimes where it doesn't even use the same logic string to get to this response. It's basically coming up with a different articulation of the scenarios. And because of the really random weight of the tokens, it comes up with an incorrect response in one scenario, what came with the correct response in another scenario. And it looks like there was something similar to that, although the articulation was a little bit different. It wasn't necessarily the response was different, or sorry, the answer was different, but the response, the reasoning it gave did change based on how much prompting was provided there. So some interesting findings there. Cindy, what'd your group find?
We had all right answers except for with few shot chain of thought. We had one incorrect answer where we ask if the guests are guidelines that auditors use to perform audits and report their findings. It says like, which of the following best describe what is meant by the terms of generally accepted auditing standards? And I inputted like the definition of generally accepted auditing standards to like help it. And it said that it is rules acknowledged by accounting professions because of their universal application. But the correct answer was that they're just measures of quality in the auditor's performance. And so we tried to reason with it. And even when we reasoned with it, saying like, it's not the key part on their wrong answer was like accounting profession. It did not agree. It was like, I see your point, but no.
So this is the first time I've actually had that happen. I remember this happening on Monday, and this has never happened to me in all my interactions with AI. But you gave it the detail that it needed to answer the question correctly. It answered the question incorrectly, and then argued with you that it was still the right answer, even though we know the wrong answer. Now, interestingly note, because there is an overlap in questions, I did have some students who used that question. They used that as one of their zero shot prompt questions. So it was like one of the very first questions they asked, and the AI tool got it right. So we're starting to see an interesting trend here because we're starting to see questions being answered wrong in few shot chain of thought prompts, which I want to talk about the implications of that, because that's a really troubling issue. Although it may be troubling, but it may also be hopeful. We'll talk about why here in just a second. Okay, so Lotus is the last one up. Lotus is ill today, and so Matt, I'm going to call on you to take the floor on this one.
That's fine.
All right.
So we used a couple of different AIs for the zero shot, the few shot, chain of thought. We used Copilot, and for the other two, we used GPT. But we had no problems. They got every question correct no matter what method we used.
And didn't have any were there any inconsistencies or issues with the responses, or were the responses pretty consistent with reply?
No, everything was pretty consistent.
Okay, good. Now, yeah, like I said, there may be a timeline on how effective this particular assignment may be. If I try to do this assignment again, it may just be, okay, Dr. Barnes, we did all of our questions, zero shot chain of prompt, and everything was correct. Okay. We're actually on that point right now where I think we were across the groups 12 for 12 on zero shot prompts. Okay. And if we actually get more detailed than that, that's where things become problematic. But let's talk a little bit about that, because this was an unexpected result. All right. The idea being is that if we provide chain of thought prompting, it should provide more robust results and more accurate results. Now, can we say that those are separate concerns? Providing more robust feedback is different than an accurate result. Yeah. Now, what is the logic in saying that probably the zero shot prompt and the few shot prompt had such high success rates? What do you think is probably the most likely explanation here?
Compared to training data.
Yeah. Not only does it have such a huge background in training data, it probably has this specific information in training data. We probably have a ton of people who are taking the CPA exam and says, I don't know the answer to this. I'm going to plug it into ChatGPT or plug it into Copilot and see what they say the answer is. And if he gets it wrong, then it says that isn't right. The Becker book says that it's this, and then it gets trained and gets more accurate over time. So it probably has these specific questions in multiple different scenarios. And, you know, I know specifically that I've helped to input that because I had many of my students already do that. So it's seen these questions before and now knows what the correct answers are. The issue then becomes what happens when we start adding the chain of thought prompting. It starts questioning whether things are correct. It starts questioning based on the inputs that we put in there, what the answers are. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, on one thing, it's giving us inaccurate results in some scenarios, which that's obviously a bad thing. We don't want to have inaccurate results. But what do we know about the discipline that we've chosen to be in? Is it always a correct answer and incorrect answer discipline? No. If you were going to be asking questions of an AI tool, are you going to be saying, all right, what is the proper accounting treatment in this scenario? Maybe. Okay. Are you going to be asking, okay, what would be the most appropriate accounting treatment given these circumstances? That seems like a much more likely scenario to say that you want to know, subjectively speaking, what is the proper answer? Remember we were talking about going through the CPA prep, and I say, you guys are going to get sick of that statement, which is most likely. Remember the questions always have most likely. Why do they actually say most likely instead of which is the correct answer? The reason is because we know, particularly in our discipline, that there's not necessarily always going to be a correct answer or one correct answer. There's multiple ones that could be possibilities of answers. We're looking for one's the best answer. And so in approaching this chain of thought prompting, it's trying to move from the idea that there's going to be a 100% always correct answer and saying that there's maybe 3 different opportunities that are all relevant. You're going to have to use a subjective approach to determine which is the most relevant. Now, what we know about LLM tools, and this is kind of what we talked about, large language model tools, is that they are very creative in their approach. And if you give it that chain of thought prompt, it's going to ramp up that creativity and try to approach things from a different perspective. It's just kind of hit or miss because it's a trial and error approach, which is probably a good thing from a training perspective, but probably a bad thing from a use perspective, because that's the case. Now, I guess the ultimate takeaway is here, as you all are preparing for the CPA exam, and I know that most of you in this room will be, you probably have some good news now that if you don't know what the answer to the question is and you want some insight, you can plug it into ChatGPT. I just would not necessarily put the prompt in there and say, here's all the background information, because it appears that that's actually sending an interference signal here, which is probably something that's worth researching more about why chain of thought, while well-intentioned, is creating noise in this particular process. But again, not what my expectation is, but it's a fascinating conclusion to come up with. But ultimately speaking, I do think that we're going to see these tools used. I don't know to what degree. I do think that they're going to be very, very helpful for using repetitive processes over and over again, doing the tasks that we don't necessarily want to do. And the same question still exists. Can they replace your job? The answer is potentially. But if you know how to use these tools and use them effectively, it's going to be less likely. Oh, also, if you pass your CPA exam. Okay, so let's hold that as the ultimate takeaway. And I'm going to hold all of you accountable for that. if you don't pass your CPA exam, I'm going to send you hate mail. No, I won't do that. I'll send you encouraging mail saying you can do it. You can do it. That's the better approach. And then I'll have ChatGPT do the same thing every single day. So, all right. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you all on Friday.